The Last of Us Factions multiplayer had a bit of an update from Jason Schreier, who was speaking on the Friends Per Second podcast over on the Skill Up channel on YouTube. Bloomberg's Jason Schreier, revealing that The Last of Us Factions was actually in development for 4 years with a team in the hundreds. Schreier said the project was an expensive proposition for something that was then a miss, and the game getting cancelled was not a bloodless endeavor. There were heads rolling at Sony as a result of that one. We all know from the last year or two of the game being mentioned, obviously it was shown at, I think it was Opening Night Live. It was one of the Jeff Keighley shows, maybe the Game Awards. But they went all in on it. They were very confident about it. And then something happened internally that apparently was due to Bungie doing some sort of review board conversation, the idea of how The Last of Us would work as a live service, resulting in the whole thing being shuttered. Now, obviously over time and across the last 2 months especially, we've seen Bungie themselves then lose a couple of hundred people. And the way that Bungie's being run hasn't done very well. But the fact that The Last of Us Factions was the new thing, and then they just had to scrap the entire project. Thoughts on the magnitude of it?
It doesn't make it any easier to swallow, but I guess it's finally being put into words what we kind of all assumed. I mean, I was one of those docs back in 2020 in the run-up to The Last of Us 2's release going, where's Factions?
Right.
And Neil Druckmann was saying, don't worry, we've got a...
Don't worry, Josh Brown, it's coming.
Yeah,
it's coming.
Okay, Neil, I'll trust you. And he's saying, we've got big plans for this. We're working on it hard. It's going to be its own thing. And then we figured out actually what it was, that it was going to be this standalone release with the main studio actually working on it. So you always knew that it was going to be a sunk cost in the millions when this thing was cancelled, because how many years went by without any news that it was going to drop? Like, we all assumed that it would come out a few months after The Last of Us Part 2 in 2020, and then we thought, okay, worst case scenario, it'll be next year. It'll be 2022, and then we're at the end of 2023, and it's just getting cancelled outright. So it is such a shame, and it is a learning process for the studio, no doubt, and in terms of them figuring out their priorities. But I guess I was personally naive to think that would come without a cost. And from Schreier's comments, it seems like there was a cost for whoever put this into motion and thought that this was going to be their next big project.
They must have had
pull the plug.
a really, really scary message from Bungie on the development of this game in terms of them for making them willing to make that much of a loss, which again I find baffling, because we know, and I know that Concord will not have cost the same as The Last of Us Factions. I know that other live service games that Sony put money behind won't have cost as much, but it still seems absurd to me that they would. Again, I feel like there's merit in releasing this thing.
It's almost like you might as well.
I find it really, and again, like Bungie having its own live service difficulties. Like, we know that Destiny was a huge success. We know that Destiny has a huge player base continuously, financially well, whatever. But I'm still kind of frustrated that why does Bungie get to have the final authority on over 4 years of game development that studio worked on for something that we knew was successful back in 2013, and we know that PlayStation have been lacking their own unique live service experience. It just really, really frustrates me. This whole thing seems really messy, and from a management kind of perspective, just stupid. Like, to then go to introduce the project and then just go, hey, actually, we don't think that this is going to make any money, and then just kind of back. I don't know. It's Zaslav-esque.
It's very David Zaslav. It feels like the more that comes out about Bungie, and it's not like those stories didn't exist at all. If you go back across the last 20 years, there were horror stories around the development of Halo, and especially Halo 2. But it feels like the more that comes out about Bungie, especially from on the managerial side, the messier it is. The more managers and the reputation got by on the extremely hard work of the creative teams, the art departments, the coding, etc., to be able to prop up the overall idea of what Bungie was. And obviously the execution was so good across the Halo trilogy, and especially Halo 3 and then Reach and whatever, that those other conversations just didn't get interrogated. Like, those other talking points didn't get interrogated. And now, as maybe it's the reality of game development becoming increasingly more complex, or the budgets go up, the more team members are involved, or whatever it is, Bungie themselves seem to have notably struggled across this generation, and even across the previous generation. Obviously everything with Destiny and Destiny 2, but this thing, them being revered as sort of, internally at least, as being like the mecca of live service development, Destiny being this huge deal, which it is still massively influential. But you have to, I have to imagine, just personally, fan theory side, whatever the hell you want to call it, that maybe internally they still wanted to be seen as the only way to do this, and part of that resulted in other projects being cancelled, because you still got Helldivers 2 over the finish line, Concords over the finish line. But Concord was it Fire Sprite, Firewalk?
Firewalk, I want to say.
Firewalk. The developers anyway were acquired when they were acquired. The game was already in motion. Even though obviously it does fit the idea of the Jim Ryan live service era. Still, you've got a couple of projects that got all the way to the end. But I wonder what those conversations were like. How did it go when members of Bungie were telling members of Naughty Dog / members of Sony, this ain't it, but we are it. Trust us, we've got it. And then the way that all these reports came out across the last month of like realizing just how bad Bungie were, and then Sony appointing Hiroki Totoki to investigate what was going on, and him saying that the studio don't take enough responsibility and the financials don't make sense. Like, it's crazy, really.
Yeah,
the
especially
amount of bodies on the line.
This Factions game was in production before that acquisition was finalized. So then to have this game in production, have another company come in and go, I'm not too sure about this. Maybe you should change this. Maybe you should change that. I don't know. I'm going to be forever fascinated in finding out how close Factions was to completion, because you have to assume, if they weren't just going to get it over the line, this would have been, maybe another 3 years out or something, 4 years out. And that's a long time for development. I don't know how much of that 4-year production that's mentioned here was active production. Probably a good chunk of it, but if they're making a live service game for the first time, I know they've got multiplayer experience, but it is a big undertaking for a studio more known for single player games. So I'm always going to be fascinated in how far along did you get in terms of completion, and whose idea was it to expand the scope of Factions? Was it a push from Sony saying, could we have a live service game, please, Mr. Druckmann? Can your team make that for us? Or was it their own ambition to go, you know what, I think we have something here. Let's build it out. Yeah, I'm sure that. I mean, you don't make a project like that if you're Naughty Dog, who clearly has a lot of leverage, if you don't have passion for it. But I'm fascinated with who was in charge of this, who's in charge, and who kind of, I don't know, who made the decision to say, no, we don't want to do this anymore.
There's also a wrinkle to that in terms of Neil Druckmann and Naughty Dog talk about how they're ostensibly the anomaly under the Sony umbrella. Like, they are able to take longer than other studios can, and they're able to dictate what they want to do just because of past successes. But the buck stopped at the live service conversation, and they weren't able, for however the reality of that conversation went, they weren't able to say, no, it's worth it. And I think it's interesting alongside that, saying that live service projects can only be a certain way. I think most people are getting sick of that style of live service. A Naughty Dog live service game, for better or worse, would have been something different.
I think there is an issue in terms of some of the big successes we've seen in live service at the minute have been very reactive and not proactive in terms of we are going, like, you look at PUBG coming out and it being a truly original battle royale concept, along with stuff like, was it like Daisy or whatever that it kind of took inspiration from. You then get Fortnite adjusting its development to then become a free-to-play battle royale sensation, which completely wipes out the competition. You have Call of Duty upset its entire, multiplayer pillar to get into free-to-play live service battle royale stuff, which then influences the microtransaction pillars, the entire structure of how those games are monetized. I wonder if we're in a point now with live service where any costly endeavor in that area makes no business sense because the trends are so fluctuating and gamers are rewarding reactivity and accessibility over something that is truly original. You look at something like X Defiant showing up and blowing up earlier this year. I don't think that's a well put together game, but because it's free to play, people are jumping into it. I feel like this is the issue now that maybe publishers are looking at, is that we can't invest as much time into a sturdy live service product because the trends are so fluid, and we could end up with something like a Suicide Squad, or if Concord fails, another Concord, in terms of like stuff that
Concord's definitely
everything is so in motion and in flux at the minute, and obviously game dev is getting more and more protracted, which is how you get stuff like Suicide Squad. So I wondered, are we entering a cheapification of live service in terms of where stuff like Helldivers 2 is the exceptional product, where it's like they put a lot of time and then just manage to strike, hit lightning, capture lightning in a bottle and make a success that way? Or are we going to be continuing to have these moments where we just get lots and lots of failures, and then the kind of like, I feel cruel saying this, but the lowest common denominator kind of experiences, which are free-to-play shooter games, that react to those certain trends kind of pick up.
I think that's already happened. Like I think we're watching the aftermath of that, and they can't stop it anymore. Like the more unique approach to a live service title is Helldivers 2. It's not free to play. They managed to hit a bit of a middle ground with the £35 price point. So you've got that working, like the idea of an audience gravitating to something that's a bit different and rejecting the standard model, which is what Concord is. Even though that's still not free to play, it might end up going free to play or getting put on PS Plus to try and get people to try it, because gameplay wise it's really solid. Like it's just that it's everything you've seen a million times before. But I do wonder, like all these decisions that were made years prior, now you're seeing the fallout, but you could not get a more stark contrast between the success of Helldivers 2, barely marketed, barely talked about from Sony's side, versus Concord, which got out there, got a big showcase, everything else, and then it's so publicly rejected. Like just, it's out in like a week and no one cares, like at all. Whereas Helldivers 2 pretty much like grabbed the entire year's media and said, look at this for like at least its launch month.
I've got two things that I kind of want to add to this. One is I'm fascinated by Naughty Dog's reevaluation of this, like I've said, but more importantly, like what that would mean for their other projects. Like you said, game dev is so lengthy now, but in a case of a live service game, it's not just the game dev, it's supporting it afterwards. That's still going to take so many developers, so much time, so much investment to keep that property updated. I wonder if they were just looking at what they want to do. It seems like Neil Druckmann's making a new IP next, but it seems like he's going to circle back around to The Last of Us Part 3 at some point. In just those two projects alone are, 8 to 10 years? If you're lucky,
PS6
could be
games.
even longer. Yeah, they're PS6 games. And if you throw in another 3 years of Last of Us Factions development on top of that, and then the tail to keep it supported afterwards, it's a lot of manpower, it's a lot of resources, and it's even more time. And I think that
was part of the report last year, was
Right.
that apparently they didn't have a long enough tail on what they would do. But I don't know how verified that was overall.
I mean, I'm not a creator on the level of those artists at these studios, but if I was mapping out essentially the next 15 years of my life from 3 games, that's got to be daunting to a certain degree and make you kind of reevaluate or evaluate the stuff that you want to work on, the stuff you're passionate about. I don't know if that's true. That's just something that popped into my head. Secondly, I do think this is a miss though, because you guys have just sparked something in my brain. Like the current live service games, the current multiplayer games, there are so few that are adult orientated in terms of their aesthetics or gameplay, and I hadn't realized that until now.
Even Call of Duty has seeded ground in this area to get Optimus Prime and stuff in.
100%.
So
Like that's you're shooting people, it's guns, it's violent, it can be sweary, but Nicki Minaj is there, Optimus Prime's there, Deadpool's there, and I like that. But it would have been so cool to get something like The Last of Us Factions if it leaned into the violence and the brutality of the base game, because that in and of itself, even though that's not different when it comes to mainstream video games, it is different when it comes to live service games and the live service experience, because we're so used to free-to-play games or live service games being so broadly accessible and so broad, try to get such a broad appeal that you'd never see a kind of real focused vision. The only thing I can think of off the top of my head is something like Hunt Showdown, which is more focused, or Siege when it first started. But even that,
There's still GTA Online. Like as goofy and as over the top and flying cars as GTA Online got, you're not throwing fireballs and flying around the place. Like
you are flying around everywhere now.
not like superpowers though. Like,
like
you're not kicking off the ground like Superman.
Even then though, right at launch, that you had like the Tron game
bikes.
modes, the Tron bikes. You had like and I liked all this stuff. Don't get us wrong, but you had like the stunt ramps, the Hot Wheels-esque things in the air, the flying cars.
That homogenization of theme that I think you've done well to point out there, because like it's not really kind of across my mind that the idea that so much of the stuff that we get right now is like neon pink and green, and I'm like, I like neon pink and green. I'm having my Bratz summer right now, but at the same time, I would like to have a kind of grittier theme to it. There's the new Delta Force game, which is actually looking pretty interesting. I don't know if you've seen gameplay of it.
No.
It's going to be free to play. It's called Delta Force Hawk something Ops. I can't remember what it's called, but it looks pretty good. It looks like an actual Battlefield competitor.
Right, cool.
It's going to have a single player based on Black Hawk Down, which is also pretty cool. We need to have these things, because without them, we are getting a less, and it's interesting to say we want to have dour, dark, gritty games, and then say that it leads to a less vibrant genre.
Yeah.
But
I
it
think
is
there's ways to
the
do it.
truth.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's ways to do it.